It's hard to believe, but the Nintendo Switch has been out for 5 months now, meaning we've had access to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild for that same amount of time. I wanted to make sure I knew all I could about the game before I made a review on it, and I didn't anticipate it taking 5 months. Even after all this time, I'm sure there's still things I don't know about the game, but I feel after almost half a year of playing Breath of the Wild, I know enough to discuss my opinions on it in this video. I'll be grading different aspects of the game by using the letter system that's commonly used in schools, so A would be great, B would be pretty good, C is just average, and D, well, it's pretty terrible. And obviously F would be failing, but that's only if the game completely messed up a concept, which doesn't happen very often. At the end of the video, I'll give my final grade for the game based on the grades it received in each of the categories I go over, which cover different parts of the game. There are 5 categories I will be going over that you can see on screen. If you would like to skip to a certain section, there will be timestamps in the description. Keep in mind this review isn't for the game's DLC, so I won't discuss the Trial of Sword. If you're interested in my thoughts on the trials, you can click the card on the top right of the screen to view that video. I also won't be spoiling anything until the section about the game's story, and I'll warn you ahead of time for spoilers in case you don't want to know the ending. When we get there, if you'd like to skip that section, again, there are timestamps in the description. So let's get started. The first category is about the open world. When Link first ventures out into the open, we're greeted with a vast scenery of open land, in areas that as gamers we're programmed to assume we can't reach. I played through the entire Great Plateau, admiring how much detail was put into the landscape that I never thought I'd be allowed to explore. So naturally I was pretty surprised when they gave me a paraglider and set me free to roam the map. I wandered for a while expecting to hit a barrier at some point soon, but even after it felt like I had walked for hours, I checked my map and I barely traveled halfway to Death Mountain. The world is filled with random activities and distractions that meaningfully add to the gameplay, and aren't just pointless additions meant to pad out the game time as we've seen in some other open world titles. Even when I was running through open space, it made it all the more sweet when I found a horse stable or a pack of enemies. I never felt like there was nothing for me to do, even when I was tasked with traveling across the world with no knowledge of what was ahead. The early hours of the game when you have nothing on your map were some of the best, and I was able to freely explore and discover surprises without seeing them ahead of time. I remember a point early in my gameplay when I first discovered a horse. I wasn't aware at first that you could ride them, but I soon saw a pack of bokoblins on horseback not far from where the other horses were grazing. In hindsight, this was no accident. The developers purposely put this group of enemies on horseback near the field to show the player that horses can be tamed, and in my case it worked. After I took out the group, I snuck up on a horse and was able to ride it around. This is some ingenious open world design that acts as a form of tutorial while still giving the player the sense that they discovered it on their own, even though the developers provided many clues. That field I was on also happened to be near a horse stable, so I wandered up to it to see if the people were friendly and was greeted by a man telling me how to board my horse. It was an incredible experience and all of it felt genuine. It really felt as if I explored the world and figured it out myself. This is something only Nintendo can pull off well, as they kept that feeling of discovery while still making sure you could figure it out eventually. Although a vast majority of it I'm fond of, there were a couple mistakes I believe with Nintendo's design of Hyrule. Because the developers focused so much on exploration and completing a task in any way the player wants to do it, there were naturally some problems that occurred because of it. I wasn't a fan, for example, of them not teaching you some basic combat tactics that are extremely helpful, like shield deflecting. Once you can master pressing A as soon as the enemy strikes your shield, combat becomes a lot more fun. Instead of jumping in, slashing your opponent, and jumping away, shield parrying makes it so the player can stand up close to the enemy and not back away from the fight. I feel this concept should have been introduced early on in the game so players could work on mastering it as they progress through the story, but that's a small problem in the grander scale of this world Nintendo has created. I like the system for discovering sections of the map by climbing towers. It was another really cool distraction that rewarded you with the overview of that part of the map. On my first playthrough, I often ignored the towers, and my journey was much more difficult because of it. Once I realized I should start climbing the towers, I went to like 5 in a row, and it revealed a huge section of the world. It was always fun to observe the newly discovered details on the map and see secrets that I missed the first time, such as a river flowing through a mountain I thought was solid, or a plain filled with ruins I thought were empty. Each tower had some sort of obstacle to get through, and it was always fun finding unique ways to get to the top by whatever means necessary, like jumping off a tall distant mountain and consuming stamina restoration meals until I landed at the top and avoided all the enemies. In any other game, if I did something like that, I'd feel like I cheated the system, but in Zelda, I feel like I outsmarted the puzzle the developers wanted me to tackle. Overall, I think the open world was beautifully designed around the core mechanics and philosophy of the game, encouraging exploration and finding unique ways to solve problems. Although there are a couple missteps due to the incredibly open nature of the map, nothing takes away from my experience significantly, so for the open world in Breath of the Wild, I give it a letter grade of an A. Almost perfection. It's incredible, and I'm not sure how Nintendo will ever be able to top an open world as fun as this. The next category is about the enemies and combat in Breath of the Wild, including bosses, so if you don't want spoilers of the final boss battle, check the timestamp in the description for the next section. When you start out the game, the weapon you usually find at the beginning is a tree branch, which isn't very powerful and breaks fairly easily. This is a perfect way for the developers to start teaching you combat, as you are using an object from the environment, or the wild, on an enemy. That alone teaches the player to use his environment in combat, as anything as simple as a tree branch could be used against the enemy. The fact that the branch breaks almost immediately also shows the player one of the essential combat mechanics in Breath of the Wild, the brittle weapons. So just by giving you a tree branch at the beginning of the game, the developers explain a lot about the combat system, and this is what I think makes the fighting so much fun. I have heard quite a few criticisms of the easily breakable weapons in the game, but I kinda like them. It adds a sense of survival and strategy, as you carefully want to choose the weapon that will be most effective against each enemy. Because I know my weapons will break, I make sure not to use my stronger swords on weaker enemies, such as skeletons who basically die in one hit to anything. This adds more variety in the gameplay, rather than past Zeldas where Link would just run up and swing a sword at the bad guys. Because the weapons break so easily, it makes it so I have to think before I engage, and that's how combat in Breath of the Wild is meant to be approached. You think through the situation and use your environment. I also love the different enemy types you'll see on your adventure. Bokoblins are definitely my favorite, as the developers put a lot of time into their behavior and actions. They're fun to watch and do some really interesting things. It's also funny how doby they are in combat, but if you underestimate them, they can tear you apart. Lizalfos are another cool enemy type. They can swim, so if you encounter one, you can't just drown it like you can with Bokoblins. Their movement patterns are often unpredictable, so engaging them is always a gamble, which keeps it fun. You don't know if they'll jump at you out of nowhere or jump back and spit at you. Players always kept alert around these creatures, and I love that. Probably my favorite enemy from a technical standpoint are the skeletons. They die in one hit to basically anything, so you don't want to use your strongest weapons against them, because it won't kill them outright. After one hit, their head pops off, and oftentimes you have to chase it before it rolls away or goes back on its body. For whatever reason, this is hilarious to me, and I appreciate how it switches up the gameplay, making you change weapons to better deal with their unique attributes. Now on to bosses. The 4 bosses at the ends of the dungeons were all pretty unique, and it took me a while to figure out their mechanics and how to counter them. In my opinion, the hardest boss by far was Thunderblade Ganon, as he wielded electricity which would constantly disarm Link and make him scramble to pick up his things. To defeat him, Link had to raise metallic bars with magnesis, so when they were struck, they would damage Ganon. I appreciate how these bosses incorporated the different runes in unique ways. The boss in Zora's Domain, for example, required the player to use Cryonis to quickly traverse across the water. The 4 bosses were a ton of fun, and each mechanic that was used felt fresh and never felt gimmicky. The only boss I was slightly disappointed by was Calamity Ganon himself. You didn't really have to use anything other than your shield and your sword to defeat him, which I was a bit disappointed by. Still, his character model was really cool, and it is always epic to fight, so I'll let his lackluster mechanics slide. Overall, I love the way Breath of the Wild establishes and executes upon their combat. It's always a ton of fun, and I'm constantly figuring out new tactics in battle that I didn't know were possible. The awesome enemy design and the fresh and satisfying combat have me give it an A+. It's practically perfect in every way, and the game is so fun because of it. Next we have the puzzles throughout Hyrule, mainly the shrines in the dungeons. I guess this is where things get a bit more negative, as I'm not a huge fan of the shrine puzzles. I think the idea of shrines themselves are pretty cool. They're puzzles you can discover that also act as fast travel points. But the actual puzzles inside of them often feel like an afterthought. There are only a handful that really tested my knowledge of the game's mechanics and my ability to think through problems. The majority of shrines felt a bit cheap. The combat trial shrines were especially annoying, as they weren't very difficult and each time I entered one I felt cheated out of a real puzzle. I'd be fine with a couple combat trials, but not as many as there are now. The other shrine type that bugged me were the ones that you would enter and immediately finish it, as apparently the true task was arriving at that shrine. This would make sense for difficult shrine quests like Eventide Island, but sometimes I'd just find a shrine behind a wall of rocks and it wouldn't give me a puzzle. Far too many of the shrines stray away from actual puzzles and just make you fight some more. I would be more annoyed with this if I didn't enjoy the combat as much as I do, but even still, I wanted a majority of the shrines to be filled with challenging, well thought out puzzles. To be fair, there were quite a few good shrine quests, such as Eventide Island or any of the mazes. These were fun ways to access a shrine beyond just discovering them on accident. But there were very few shrines that were actually memorable, as most just made you figure out what rune it wanted you to use, then you could run through it. I really wish Nintendo could have put more time into each puzzle, and although making 120 great puzzles would have been extremely difficult, it's part of what makes Zelda Zelda, and I believe they need to work more on the shrine challenges. Another little thing I dislike is the pretty underwhelming reward for completing all 120 shrines. Although I really wanted a tunic for Link, it was undercut by the fact amiibos can give you an even better looking tunic without really doing anything in the game. I mean, I'm fine with the amiibo rewards, but come on, give us a little more for beating every shrine. But let's move on from shrines. I wasn't really happy with them, and on their own I think I would give them a B-. But let's discuss the dungeons. There were only 4 dungeons in the game, but I believe they were expertly designed. I can tell that a majority of the development time went into perfecting these huge puzzles over the shrines, and they're so good I almost think it was worth it. I loved how you could control the divine beast and shift its parts around so Link can reach the different stations. A couple of the dungeons took me hours and hours, as I would try different things to see what would work, and even through all that time that I spent, I was rarely frustrated, as the game encouraged encouraged me to keep thinking through problems and find the right solution. It was immensely rewarding when I was finally able to finish a dungeon and collect all of its chests. I specifically remember the first dungeon I unlocked in Zora's Domain being almost frighteningly large. I didn't realize I was on a giant elephant until I checked my map. These kinds of surprises are what makes the dungeons in Breath of the Wild so amazing, and I can hardly wait for the second DLC pack to bring us a fifth. Because of the incredible challenges found in the game's 4 dungeons, my grade for the puzzles in Breath of the Wild overall is a B+, not quite reaching an A only because of the repetitive nature of the shrines. Still, a B+ is pretty good, but something that could be improved for a future title. Next up is the story in Breath of the Wild, so obviously there will be story spoilers in this section. The simple explanation of the story in this game would be Link needs to defeat Ganon and save Zelda to save Hyrule. I wouldn't really expect much more than that, especially from Nintendo, who likes to stick to the same plot lines, but I was pleased how the story did vary a bit and had some fun moments. There was such little voice acting that I wouldn't call this game voice acted by any means, but there were some cutscenes that included characters speaking to advance the story. I've heard some people complain the voice acting is too bland and boring, and while I wouldn't disagree, I was pretty fine with the voice actors. A game as humble and solemn as this isn't really meant to have over-the-top emotional voices, so I was fine with the performances by the 4 heroes, Zelda and Impa. They did what they were supposed to and added a bit to the story, but again, it was so seldom and didn't really make too much of a difference. I didn't really like how the actual storyline was based in flashbacks that you had to find. I wish the flashbacks would just appear every so often after Link did a storyline quest. That way anyone could see the whole story while playing the game, rather than the majority of the story being optional and not necessary to beat Ganon. I feel like it all could have been laid out better, and although I don't have many problems with the story itself, it was too brief and often didn't happen in order, so unless the player really cared about the events that happened in the past, he or she wouldn't get much out of the storyline. So although the story was at many points sweet and a pleasant surprise, the fact that the memories were spread out and often not in order made it so the story was hard to track and didn't really have much as an emotional impact as it could have. So I give the story a B+. Now let's move on to the final category. Finally, we have the endgame, or the replay value for Breath of the Wild. So to be blunt, there are a lot of fun things to do after you've beaten the game. For example, because once you've beaten Ganon, the game technically doesn't end, I like to hike back up to the castle sometimes and see how fast I can take him out. And another fun thing, with the DLC I can place a travel medallion right outside his lair so I can immediately fight him at any point. But like I said earlier, I'm not supposed to take the DLC into account. I also enjoy shield surfing down snowy mountains and trying to beat my time with the old surfer lady who lives up there. It's also fun to try and get all the shrines, even if the reward is lackluster. But the way I see it, Breath of the Wild's endgame is sort of like retirement. There might be some fun things to do, but none of it really helps you progress once you've beaten all the shrines. In retirement, you can take up a hobby like golfing or painting, while in Zelda you can do fun activities like shield surfing or chest searching. Both are fun, but don't really mean anything. Why gather a bunch of materials if I have nothing really to use it on? Why take out that pack of goblins if I don't need their items? All of these problems happen once you beat the game and complete all the shrines. Sure, there are side quests, but I've already done most of the meaningful ones so I can make Link more powerful to finish the main story, which I've already done. It's a bit redundant, and while every game technically has this problem, I find it happening in this game more than most. But what this game does do better than most is those random fun things, which are what keep me coming back. Breath of the Wild says, you may only have cheap fun things left to do, but darn it, we're gonna give you the best cheap fun things to do. And they succeed in it. You wanna put some balloons on a boat and sail the skies? Do it. You wanna roll a snowball down a hill until it becomes huge and kill something? Do it. You wanna take a chicken to an enemy camp and use it to kill them? Do it. You wanna attach 2 minecarts together and fly up to a dragon? Do it. You wanna land on top of a guardian and steer it around? Do it. It's these random things in the environment that keep me coming back to Breath of the Wild, and there's so many of them. But sadly, the side quests don't get my attention as much as they hoped they would. So after completing all the shrines and finishing the story, Breath of the Wild's endgame falls just short of being great. Overall, although there are a lot of fun things to do, I will give the replay value for Breath of the Wild another B+, as I wish there would have been more out there for completionists. And I'm not even trying to get all the Korok seeds, the reward is so pointless. Overall, Breath of the Wild is a pretty fantastic game that just falls short in a few categories. For me, the story could have been laid out better, the shrine puzzle deserved more attention, and the endgame could have more to do. But all these things don't take away from the fact that Breath of the Wild has an incredible open world that keeps surprising me. and a combat system that is as complex as it is fun. Nintendo did a fantastic job on this game, and it's hard for me to ask them to improve it when so much of it was amazing. For the final grade, I give The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild a solid A-, and I would recommend it to anyone who owns a Switch or a Wii U. It's a must-have for all types of gamers. Anyway guys, that'll do it for today's video. Let me know if you agree with me in the comments, or if you disagree, tell me what parts of the game you liked or disliked. I'm interested to see what the community thinks about the game 5 months in. This review took me a while to make, so if you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate it if you left a like. And other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.